So, sometimes you have a bit of theatrics because it makes people feel a bit more special. And sometimes the ugliest, weirdest, grossest man on the planet will make you have the most explosive orgasm and then you don't know what to do with yourself.
I'm Mia Friedman and welcome to No Filter. I'm so glad you're here. I don't think I've ever interviewed someone whose name I didn't know before, during or even after our conversation. But in this episode, that is exactly what happened, and there's a very good reason for it. The woman you're about to meet goes by a few different names because she's a sex worker. And like many people in her industry, she uses different names to help maintain her privacy. My guest today goes by the name Gia when she's doing sex work. But when she's working as a writer, she calls herself Rita Therese. Her real name, I suspect, is something else again. But today, we're going with Rita because that's the one on the cover of her new book, which is a memoir. Rita has spent the last 6 or 7 years working in all different parts of the sex industry. And now she's used all of those experiences, as well as her enormous writing talent, to share them with us in a new book called Come. I picked up Rita's book to read quickly because I don't always get as much time as I'd like to read the books written by all my guests here on No Filter. But I did not put this book down or do anything else for the next few hours. I just couldn't. I've read a few memoirs by sex workers and I always really enjoy peeking into a world that's so mysterious to many of us. But Rita's is something else entirely. It is exceptional. Something I didn't know about Rita until our conversation, and she sort of mentioned it towards the end, is that she was recently diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum. And as you'll find, she's funny and cheeky and brash, and she takes us into all sorts of places that many women have never ever been, like a bucks party and a strip club, a brothel and a porn set. Rita's story is also tinged with some really deep personal sadness, so beware on this episode. There's a content warning. The discussion of suicide is one that we have, and there's very much a language warning as well. Needless to say, this is not one to listen to on speakerphone in a public place. You are going to love meeting Rita Therese, where you will learn everything in this episode, from why a paddling pool is an essential part of a sex worker's arsenal, and how things are going at the moment while the industry has been entirely shut down because of COVID-19. I want to start off by asking for a quick education in terminology, and I always do this with industries and groups of people that I would probably describe as marginalised or misunderstood, because often the way you talk about yourselves is different to the way other people talk about you. And so tell me what you like your job to be referred to and what you like to be referred to as in the context of what you do for a living.
Sex work is always good. Sex work is pretty good, universal across the board. And Rita, sex worker, and my job is sex work.
The book starts actually with a terrible phone call, but I want to get to that in a moment. Mm-hmm. I want to ask you first about this hidden world that most people don't know about the topless and nude waitressing at private parties and functions. Can you explain a little bit about that world?
So when I started in that industry, that was 2012, 2011. And I'm basically people who have like a bucks party or they've got, a end of work tradie breakup, they'll hire nude waitresses or topless waitresses. And you're sort of a bartender, you're sort of like you're sort of entertainment, but mostly what you're doing is just hanging out and socializing, getting drinks and talking to people. And that was pretty intimidating to do, straight off the bat when I came into sex work. It's a big group of guys and you're by yourself, but or you're with just one other girl. But it also was really fun. Like I remember having a lot of fun especially when I got to a group of guys that were really cool. Or I remember going to one bucks party and they had done they were all really nerdy and really sweet, and they'd done like a Knights of Camelot thing. So they were all dressed in like night outfits, like medieval night outfits, and they were doing like pretend jousting in the living room, and it was so much fun. And they were all like school teachers. It was really, really cute. So those ones were, I think other people might have been a bit like, what the fuck? But I was like, this is the coolest bucks party I've ever been to.
You described the first time you went to one of these events to Topless Waitress, and I was trying to, I guess the closest I've come is sunbaking topless at the beach, and even when I used to do that, the moment that you have to stand up and walk to the water is really quite daunting. And that's what I kept thinking about when you were can you describe that first booking and what it felt like?
I just distinctly remember the pink shag bath mat, this pink shag bath mat, and it was so freaking cold. It was the middle of winter, and I was just like, great, no central heating, love that. And coming down the stairs, it was really nerve-wracking because it's not very usual and everyday to be topless around a bunch of strangers, especially if you're 18. So, and I think, how did I feel? I think I felt good, but I also felt really nervous. And I think that nervousness was about, my understanding of nudity and nakedness was like men's magazines. And I think my main fear I had was like, does my body look good enough to be here? When you actually really unpack it, I think it was less about the nudity and more about the insecurity.
I thought that was so interesting because I would have thought that the fear would come from feeling physically vulnerable, like you're surrounded, you're in often a suburb that's miles away from where you live, you've caught public transport to get there, and you're there with one other girl and a whole bunch of men that you don't know in a house. Yeah,
we are pretty lucky because the people that would all, like the lady that I worked for, she would I don't know, we didn't have security, but we had a kind of a boss that we would check in with, and we could regularly text her as well too. Look, honestly, sometimes I do look back and I go, how the did I like get through? How did I manage that for so many years, like going to these houses? But I think when guys are in a group like that, usually what happens is there would be maybe one or two who'd be a bit, how's it going? And then the rest of them would be pretty normal. And then it was kind of like a sliding scale. So there'd be at least 2 to 5 men in that group, and the ratio would get bigger or smaller depending on how many people were there, who were pretty good men. And you knew that if one guy was being super inappropriate, you could usually, in this kind of Machiavellian manipulation way, sort of go and find the men who were good and just say, like, your friend's acting a bit weird. At the end of the day, the guys don't want the girls to go home. They want them to stay because they've paid you. And so they're going to usually police the men who are behaving badly, their behaviour.
How much would you be paid? Would it be by the hour?
Yeah, I think back in the day the going rate was $60 in 2011 for an hour, topless waitressing, and then nude was about $100 an hour.
Would things usually escalate when you got there? Like would there be pressure to then do nude waitressing once you were topless?
No, guys at the end of the day always were like, oh, won't you go naked? And then they'd be like, I'll give you $10. And you're like, no. We used to do tips for tits. That was pretty fun. So you'd walk around, one of the girls taught me to do this, you'd walk around with a jug and you'd be like, I'm going to go nude, but I want you all to contribute. And so you would probably, maybe you could get anywhere from an extra $100 to like $400 by doing that. So did I ever feel pressured? No, because I was always about, at the end of the day, making money. And so I saw these added extras as a way to make money. But no, I never felt particularly pressured because I was always, when I was young and I was the newbie, I was surrounded by older workers. And so whatever I wasn't doing, they were like, woohoo, I get to make more money now because there's, someone here doesn't want to get naked, but I do, less competition.
You wrote about how it could get uncomfortable when guys turned on you at a job. Can you remember a time when that happened?
I did get really upset once because they were annoyed that I wouldn't get down to a thong for free, and I'm a big believer in hustling and making money. And I was like, nah, give me $50. And he's like, nah, you should marry. And then, I don't know, he kind of kicked off a little bit, and I went to another room and I just went, fuck this, I'm going home. Like, see you later, you know, I don't need to be spoken to poorly. Was it ever like particularly scary or really threatening? There was one that a boyfriend of mine years ago drove me to. My God, I've completely forgotten about it till now. And we were in this weird ass Silent Hill country town, and I was doing a really small bucks party. And the guys just got weirder and weirder and weirder.
In what way weird?
Oh, like this. It was so long ago. We were sitting in the lounge room, and I was doing this is when I started doing shows. So I stopped kind of waitressing, and I would just go from bucks party to bucks party to bucks party, and I do strip shows. So like with dildos and whipped cream, the whole thing. And one of the guys kind of edged closer to me, and they kept trying to kind of put their hands like up, like on my ass. And then one guy almost like slipped his fingers inside of me, and I had to realize that, you know, my boyfriend at the time was amazing, but he was one guy against maybe 10. So I think he and I kind of caught each other's eye. He saw what happened. I kind of looked at him, and we both were like, oh, what? Look at the time. Oh, my God, we're running late to our next job. And really politely and really friendly kind of de-escalated. And I just kind of grabbed my things. We got out of there. They were a bit weird, but they were kind of like, it was actually really scary. Now I look back on it, because once we got to the car, my partner was like, he was really, he had a knife on him, and he was like, he showed it to me, and he's like, you know, I had the knife just in case. But yeah, it was pretty full on. Looking back, like my partner's got this knife and was zooming out of the whole place. But that was a pretty, you know, once-off kind of occasion. Like, that was a very strange thing to happen. Whereas for the most part, that was like the weirdest oddity. And I do feel lucky. I was lucky that I always usually had my boyfriend, or at one point I hired a driver who was a bodybuilder, like 7'5" and 200 kilos. So no one did anything when he was around. So I was pretty lucky, I suppose.
Before you started doing the shows, when you were just doing the topless and the nude waitressing, you would observe that, you know, during the night at some stage the stripper would arrive to do the show. Can you and you talk about how pretty much every bucks night goes through the same kind of routine. How does it work, and what do the strippers do, and how do the men behave?
When I first started out, so when I was just doing the topless waitressing, basically the package that they often had was like, you got two girls that did 2 hours of topless waitressing, and then at some point the stripper would arrive. And the strippers were like going show to show, and they would, you know, maybe do 10 in one night. And the guys were kind of weird. And this is a really big turning point for me, where I started to realize, I suppose, what I would now understand as a whorearchy, or a kind of hierarchy of whoredom. And the men would suddenly, whilst they'd be incredibly turned on and really engaged by the strippers, they would turn back to you and make these sly comments, or these sideways comments, or this stuff. I would never date a woman who did something like that. And I'm like, dude, my fucking boobs are out, my pussy's out. I'm literally sitting next to you. The only thing that's different is I don't have a dildo in me. And that was when I started to see this kind of almost kind of gross Madonna whore thing that men would do. And I just realized, I was like, they're so full of shit, you know? And they would be so lovely to the stripper, and then they'd make these really foul comments as soon as she'd leave. And I think that was when I was like, you know what, I'm going into stripping, because it doesn't matter. There's no good girls here, you know. We're all fucking sinners. We're all bad girls. So why not make the most money?
You write in the book about the men saying to you, "Oh, I'm so glad you don't do that. I'm so glad you don't do that," to sort of co-opt you into their slut shaming.
Yeah, literally. And I was like, I would do that. I think it's very brave to do that. It's actually also very hard to do that. And the girls that would dance, the strippers I met on that, we call it the circuit, because it's like the circuit of girls you'd meet. You know, they were like penthouse pets. They were so beautiful, and they had these amazing costumes, and their level of showmanship and like it was like otherworldly. I was so excited when the strippers arrived because I wanted to see them perform. They were like burlesque artists or like amazing. So yeah, I kind of went, you know what, I'm a bit tired of ducking into a fucking esky to fish out a Jim Beam and Coke for $60 an hour. I'm going to start doing dance strip shows to Whitesnake.
And how do you go about making that transition, Rita?
One of the girls I worked with started teaching me, and then I just started practicing at home in the lounge room. And then my boyfriend at the time, the aforementioned knife holder for that particular booking, he and I went to Kmart and we got this classic stripper thing, this like kids paddling pool, and we put it in the back garden, and I would practice my shows. He actually and then he remixed me a couple of songs that I really liked, and we'd like put it on the stereo and I'd go through and practice it, and then I just started doing that every weekend.
You say, you know, the classic stripper thing with the kids paddling pool. I've never been to a bucks party, so I don't know why. Where does the paddling pool come into it?
So when you have different kinds of shows, and one of them is called, I don't know, it can be like the oil show, or strawberries and cream is like whipped cream and strawberries, but strawberries are annoying, so you usually would get the little red lollies. But the end of
Why
the show.
Why are strawberries annoying?
Oh, just like because they go soft and mushy in the car when you're carrying them around. Yeah. So you want to have something a bit easier and more portable. So by the time you finish your show, after you've put baby oil on yourself and you've put freaking shaving cream or whipped cream and you're like covered in all this various stuff, you drag out the paddling pool, and what looks like a sexy shower that you're giving yourself with like the big sponge is actually you removing the debris.
So saves time.
It saves time. So, like, it is like, obviously you would have a normal shower if you could, but when you're zipping from show to show to show, it not only does it look really sexy, but you're also able to get the whipped cream off you and the strawberries off you. And then you just dunk the water. So, you know, like the big clamshells that you put, the kids like do the digging in and the water side. Yeah, you just bring one of them with you.
You know, I always imagine it as these very distinct dividing lines between you know, being a topless waitress and then being a nude waitress and then being the stripper and then having sex for money for the first time. When you're in it, does it feel right? I am at a crossroads. Which decision am I going to make? Do I cross over to the other side? Or is it just something that kind of gradually happens and you don't really notice?
I think the crossover moment for me was like, I went probably one of the last times I worked as a topless waitress. We were and I did write about this in the book. We went and I think I put this book, I can't even remember what I wrote, but I remember this booking, and I went into one of the rooms, and this guy, I'd done, you know, a bit of disco dust, and I was walking around, and I came into one of the bedrooms, and this man was just like lying there, just chilling, and he's like, hello, and I'm like, hi, and he had like his little box of tissue set up and this lube, and I'm like, what's going on in here? And he goes, I'll give you $300 if you give me a hand job. I'm like, all right. Like, I didn't even think twice. I was like, why not? And I locked the door, and I was like, oh my God. And then I did it, and I felt really bad only because one of the things that I didn't want to fuck over my friends I was working with. Like, I didn't want guys to be like, well, she gave me a hand job, so you should, and you know what I mean? So that was the only thing I felt bad about. But I remember it was so quick and so easy, and I was like, oh, that's the same amount of money I make for doing a, you know, half an hour strip show. So I was like, oh, I'll take that. And I don't know, I guess when I was working at a brothel, that was the thing I did after doing stripping. Like, I was working at a brothel. I actually was working at the brothel when I was pregnant, before I had an abortion. And I was, I think, too not feeling great about my body to probably have gone and escorted. And I needed to make money as well too. So it was kind of a weird beginning of doing full service. Like, I had escorted before that, but only really briefly and with that super weird agency. So I don't think I ever really got into the swing of full service until I was doing it when I wasn't in such a chaotic place, you know?
What does full service mean, Rita, for those who don't know?
Full service is like full sex work, so penetrative sex or kind of start to finish.
Right. And tell me about what it means when a sex worker goes on tour.
So touring is something that you do when you go from city to city. So sometimes people choose to stay in the same city and work there forever. You can also go to other cities. You can go to Sydney, you can go to Brisbane, wherever you like, really. And I would often do that as a way to kind of have a bit of a breather from Melbourne, or to see new clients, or to meet new people.
You talked about in the book about David. Who is David?
Yeah, he was great. I met him, and he and I ended up traveling together a bit. We went to Hong Kong together. We went to Singapore. We had a really good time. It was nice. He's a really nice man, but I think in the end he was looking for someone that he could have more of a relationship with. And when I'm not being Gia, I'm a very different person. I don't think I was the right fit for him, you know?
These two personas that you had, Gia when you were doing sex work and Rita in the rest of your life, were you able to keep them quite separate?
Yes and no. I think now that I'm older and I had the chance to write this book and I had the chance to figure out who I was, I realized that, you know, being Gia was a way, I think, to deal with a lot of my own trauma and a lot of my own pain and a lot of my own sadness. And it felt like I got to kind of relegate all the best parts of myself into this other person. And then when I was Rita, I was full of a lot of self-loathing because it felt like there wasn't much left in the kitty over there, you know. And sometimes real aspects of my personality, like use that in quotation marks, will come out with clients, but it takes a long time for that to happen. It's usually people that I probably, had I met them, and I'm thinking in my head of a few people I've actually said this to over the years, that had I met them outside of my job, I would have liked them anyway.
Do most sex workers have sort of working names? Is that a typical thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's for a myriad of reasons. I mean, the first one is that there's still a huge amount of stigma against sex workers. So by having your, you know, separate worker name and your legal name, you're able to have apply for an apartment or go to university or pay a bill. It also stops clients from being able to stalk you. You know, Rita's not even my real name. So there's just, it's like, I'm Rita, but am I Rita? Like, you know, and it's just a way to keep yourself safe mostly. And I think it is about separation and divide, but it's also a safety tool.
Did you have to come out as a sex worker, or were you always pretty out? And tell me about the difference between being in, like, how are many sex workers out? Are most sex workers disguised with their identity among their friends and family?
Well, I can only speak about what I've done, and I was outed because I shot a porno with a friend of mine when we were 18, and you know, God bless her, she was excited about it, and she showed a few people, and before we knew, it was like the whole world had seen it, and I was like, dude, what the fuck did you do that for? I'm like,
I love how prosaic you sound. You know, God love her, she was a bit excited, and then my naked body having sex was on the internet.
Yeah, and it was some really bad angles of me too. Like, I look back at that video and I was like, my God, I'm like, I love that that's on the internet forever. When that happened, I was like, well, you know, this day was going to come eventually, so it's time to be out. And it was a different climate. You know, I feel like an old lady now, but it's a long time. It's been almost 9 years it is now, and it was very different 9 years ago. You know, Tumblr it was a bit salacious to be naked on Tumblr, let alone have a porn career or have a sex work career. So I was out very quickly and very soon because I was surrounded, I suppose, once I left my kind of regular quotation mark group of friends and found other sex workers, I realized, wow, there's this whole other world and everyone's really cool about their job and it's not a big shameful secret. But I also understand that a lot of other people do choose to be in and to not have their face out, to not have a public-facing persona, and to also keep it secret from their friends and family. And that completely makes sense to me, especially now that I'm older and I've decided where I want to go career-wise. There is a part of me that does have some regrets that I had chosen to be so out. You know, it's complicated.
Are there certain careers and career paths that are closed to you now because of your past?
Yeah, I definitely would have liked to have worked with kids, I think. Like, I really love children. I want to be a mother, and I would have loved to have worked with kids in a kindy or done work with children with like on the spectrum and stuff. So that can be quite challenging if you're an out sex worker. Even nannying or being a babysitting is quite hard. But other things I'm hoping that I do that I'm pursuing academically at the moment will end up kind of being okay, you know.
How about your family? You came from a big family, one of 6 kids. How did they react? Did you have to tell them individually or did someone else tell them?
My family, I don't have much to do with them except for my brother and my sisters. I don't really speak to my parents. I don't have a particularly strong relationship with either of them. That's my own choice. And I think it was sort of something that they knew about, but we never really spoke about. And at that point, when I was 17, I had already moved out of home. So it was just like, whatever, you know. Talking to my siblings about my work, it's taken some years. They've always tried to be understanding, but now especially I think they do see it as my job, what I do for work. And I think the book has probably helped them as well too to understand it a bit more.
You talk about not feeling like you were part of the queer sex worker community, but not also part of the straight sex work community. Your first sexual experience was actually with a woman, and you describe yourself as having 2 personas, a butch persona and a femme persona. Without wanting to put you in a box, how's that rolling these days?
Well, what I realized, and then I think that whole chapter kind of summarized it, was that I had found that in engaging with my femininity and engaging with who I was when I was being ultra femme felt like it was my sex worker personality. And I didn't know how to reconcile that with the other parts of myself, and how sexuality is so confusing. Confusing is the best way to put it. Confusing and murky and difficult. And I think because I grew up in such a bogan area, and it was like I had the craziest internalized homophobia, and I was like, oh, well, the only reason I like women is because I'm too ugly for men to like me. That was literally what I thought. Wow. So I went out and just fucked everything that moved when I was 17 and pretended I was straight until I, funnily enough, got into sex work and I started having different sexual experiences like threesomes or being booked for doubles, and I'm like, oh no, it's actually okay to be bisexual, it's actually fine. So it is a weird and unusual way of understanding queerness or sexuality on a spectrum, because and sometimes I was sad that when I was a teenager I didn't allow myself to have those experiences. I internalized that homophobia, that kind of bogan suburban stuff, and just kind of shut down. And it was actually, sex work that allowed me, and especially pornography and shooting porn, that was like, no, it's okay to not be straight. Like, it's actually fine. And there's lots of other women that are like you who are also bisexual, and it doesn't mean that you're not attractive to men or whatever crazy fucking idea I had at the time, you know?
What's it like to have sex with another sex worker that you don't know when you have to do doubles?
It's actually pretty cool. Because sex workers are really good at sex. It's like the Olympics of sex, you know. So it is really fun.
Do you fake it, or do you actually, you know, try to turn each other on and have good sex with each other, or is it just performative?
It depends on who you're working with. So some of my girlfriends are, you know, straight as an arrow, And if we do a double together, then I know that it's going to be as straight as an arrow double, and that's totally fine.
And what does that mean? What does a straight as an arrow double look like?
It's still like, I think for guys, they're like, yeah. And like, you know, and even one of my girlfriends actually said this to me because we were talking about it, and she's like a straight as an arrow kind of lady, and she's like, man, it's just the same thing as if I'm like, you know, I might not love the sex I'm having with my client, but I can still do it. And I was like, yeah, exactly right. But when I have done doubles with girls that I know are bisexual because we've spoken about it or it's come up in the booking, I definitely feel like there's a little bit more synergy, and just like it's a little bit more intimate for me, or a little bit more fun, and it's a bit more exciting. And it's still straight as an arrow doubles are fine. At the end of the day, you're getting paid, so whatever.
Do you have orgasms when you have sex for work?
Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you just fake one because, like, you're like, if you do not remove your octopus mouth from my clit, I'm actually going to have a nervous breakdown. And it's really funny because when I was younger, I was like, oh no, I have to have one during a booking because otherwise they won't have a good time. And so I would be there desperately trying to get myself off with the worst routes possible. And then later on, I was working with a friend of mine, and she used to do these insane fake orgasms that were so over the top. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to go along with this. And then when I did it, the guy was like, yeah, that's right. I knew I'm this and that. And I'm like, these people are from another dimension. And I was like, I cannot believe for so many years I tried so hard to have authentic orgasms because it was a waste of time. You actually can just make the craziest sounds and say that, and they don't know. They cannot differentiate between the two. But there are people that I have had really amazing sex with because we just clicked and we just got along really well. And there's some people that you just fake it with because that's what they want, you know?
Do most clients care whether you have an orgasm or not, even if it's a fake one?
I think it's an important thing to happen, and I do understand, because if I put myself in the shoes of them and I imagine being in a situation, I would probably feel very shy and very nervous, and I'd probably feel very like, fuck, I hope she likes me and I'm not like totally gross or I'm making her feel uncomfortable. And so, you know, sometimes you have a bit of theatrics because it makes people feel a bit more special, and sometimes you don't need to and sometimes the ugliest, weirdest, grossest man on the planet will make you have the most explosive orgasm, and then you don't know what to do with yourself.
Why does that happen? Is it because they're just good at sex?
Yeah, it's happened to pretty much every single sex worker I know. Is like, there'll be one time some really repulsive human being will give you this earth-shattering orgasm, and you just end up, it's almost like you look like when you put a cat in a bathtub by the end of it. You're so shocked by yourself, shocked by them, you're shocked by everything. You're like, I need to get out of here as soon as possible. It's an ugly cum with an ugly person.
You write about some of the good experiences. I don't know as a percentage how many of the sexual experiences that you've had as a sex worker you'd class as good, but you talked about good sex for you means, you know, sex with kindness and interest and desire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, good sex for me Rita, is like a whole different kettle of fish, but good sex for me at work is like, I don't know. I feel like what even is good sex for me when I'm escorting anymore now? I'm actually at a point where I'm just so about going with the flow and making sure that the client's having a good time and just vibing. And I feel like it's almost like, for me now, what's more exciting is like it kind of goes on an even plateau pretty much. And then occasionally there'll be like someone that I'll meet that I'll be like, wow, we have really great chemistry and amazing fireworks. And then for the most part, it's kind of a hum. It's kind of how the best way I can describe it is like a Tinder date that neither went really awful but not really good.
Someone who, at the other end of the spectrum, of course, you have a chapter called When a Client Rapes You. Is that something that you experience more than once?
Yeah, it was twice. I've had two particularly awful incidents, and I think that was what kind of spurred me on to be like, philosophy I'm kind of done with, and I finished that, and I was like, I want to work in law, and I want to work in, especially with women. But yeah, I did have, the first time I was sexually assaulted is actually hard because it intertwined with something that I love now, which is BDSM. So it was an incredibly strange introduction to something that I would grow to love quite deeply as I grew older, and did it with people that I actually felt safe with. But, there is still a little bit of trauma associated with it. And the second time, the second time it happened was a lot older. And that's why, and I did turn around and I did hit my client after that happened. Like, I really socked him. And that was also really scary too, because I realized that, I had this insane, deep rage inside of me, and it was almost out of control, I think, and that's when I wrote a chapter about about violence and the kind of violence that you end up internalizing and that you turn outward. Because what happened when that client assaulted me was not that my brain just fucking broke. I was like, I can't do this again. And I whipped around and I socked him really hard. And he was a big guy. He would have been like 6'3" or something, and built like a brick shithouse. And that's when it hit me. I was like, you just walloped this giant fucking man. You're alone in a hotel room. What's to stop him from strangling you, Mm-hmm. And that was really hard, because what I had to do was then de-escalate myself, de-escalate him, and continue the booking. And I honestly, they were both awful, but they were awful for different ways,
How intertwined were drugs with your sex work for you?
Not really. I don't like doing drugs with clients, because not for any moral reason, but because I don't particularly want to be high with a client. I don't want to sit there and be high and have him bring down and kill my fucking buzz. I don't want to listen to his weird music. I don't want to hear about his childhood. I want to so I would work often and just drink. And then when I was younger, I did do a lot of drugs, but that was with my friends. So, I'd work, make money, and then I'd go and buy drugs, and we would do drugs with my friends, and it was really fun. But did I do them with clients? No, not really. There's nothing wrong.
Why did you stop using drugs, and why did you give up alcohol and go to AA?
Because I started to realize that I was, with the drugs, they were really fun, but then they stopped being fun because I had no serotonin left. I had mined my serotonin down, and I was having a really hard time with calm downs, and I wasn't coping with them mentally, and I got to the point where I was getting really dark and quite suicidal. So I stopped doing party drugs, and then I went to AA in 2014 or 2015 because I just didn't know how to drink properly, and I couldn't stop drinking. And I was having really bad anxiety. So AA, I went to a meeting, and I went to the meeting after I was assaulted by a client, because and that's something else I wrote about in the book, was that so often women are blamed, I think, for their assaults because of drugs or alcohol. And at the end of the day, you should be safe enough in a room with someone that they don't take advantage of you when you're intoxicated, And that was something that I don't even think I had accepted until I had written the book, and was like, no, it's actually not your fault that man took a condom off, because he shouldn't have. He should know better.
Your book actually starts when you're in Central Australia. Or somewhere it seems like a FIFO kind of a situation. Can you explain where that was, and you get a phone call?
Yeah, I was working in Port Hedland in a brothel, a mining town brothel, and I was on a night shift there doing full service, and it was October, and I had just kind of been recovering after my brother had died earlier in March, and then the phone rang and my other brother died. So, yeah. And then there's just 8 months of not really knowing where I was or what I was doing.
You went into deep grief, and deep shock and you now realise that you had PTSD. I'm so sorry about the loss of your two brothers. I know that you write so beautifully about how close you were to them and what important figures they were in your life. How did they factor into what happened to in your life after that? Like, how do you think that made a difference?
Well, that has kind of been an issue for me when people read my book, because whilst it is about sex work, it's also about grief and about loss. And that was what I set out to do with that book. And it just so happens that I also do sex work. So the two just kind of overlapped. But what ended up happening for me was, I think, suicide, sadly, the more people in your family commit suicide, your risk of committing suicide yourself actually greatly increases. So it's something insane. I think it's like a 30% after the first one and then 50% after the second one. So knowing those statistics and knowing that now not only am I autistic and I'm a sex worker, so I'm already, pretty fucked. And then on top of that, like, I had the double whammy of two suicides in my family. It was like, how can I best put this without sounding glib? I think that I just decided I cannot continue my life the way it's going, because I'm deeply unhappy. And if I don't get my life to a place where I'm not so fucking sad all the time, where I'm not so dark and where I'm not so fucked up, I'm going to end up like my brothers. And so I think what happened and why I focus so heavily on their death and about the process of getting better, of going to therapy, and also doing work on the self and thinking about death and thinking about my life and starting to be like, okay, is this serving me? Is it actually healthy for me to live in two separate personas? Is it healthy for me to deny that I'm bisexual and I'm queer? Is it healthy for me to continuously try to have these relationships with my family? Is it healthy for me to have these obsessive friendships? And that was what I think drove the book, because it was kind of, while it is about death, it's also kind of like it is at the end of at its core about how to live and how to survive. Because if you have the odds stacked against you, mental illness, neurodivergency, sex work, I think that was what I was really trying to achieve by writing about their deaths. And also I needed to process it myself as well too. And that was a hugely important part of writing that book, was the processing, because grief is so hard and it is so confusing. And it takes years. Like, I mean, it's now 2020 and I think I'm maybe on the path to being slightly okay with it, like I'm not crying as much as I used to. But the first couple of years, it was very hard.
Tell me about the autism.
Like, I have Asperger's or autism spectrum disorder. And probably and it was only something I found out, I think, about a year and a half ago. And so it coincided with me writing the book as well too. But I never actually spoke about it in the book because I still had a lot of shame and embarrassment, I think. And there is a lot of grief as well too, I think, for other people who get diagnosed with autism later in life, because you can start to see the points and the things that happened where you go, I wish I'd known then. I wish I had known, because I maybe would have had a better chance at dealing with problems, or I would have understood why I freaked the fuck out in Melbourne Central all the time, or, I locked myself in my room for days at a time, or I hated when people touched me around the shoulders. Like, it just all this. And then when you find out, it's like, oh my God, it's a light bulb moment. And you're like, how was I walking the earth for so many years doing these things and no one knew, But masking is a huge part of autism, learning how to hide it,
What led you to be diagnosed?
One of my friends made a joke one day, and we were talking about, once again, Melbourne Central, and I was like, I fucking hate that place. I'm like, the light in there, the tiles, I'm like, everything about it is so overwhelming. And she's like, what on earth are you talking about? And I was like, obviously it's horrible. And she's like, dude, you are actually autistic. And I was like, ah, ha, ha, and we were laughing about it. And then I went to my therapist, who I see for like having issues with anxiety. And I was like, oh, the funniest thing happened the other day. My friend was like, you are so autistic. And she just gave me this look, and she was like, and it was this really long, awkward silence. And she was like, I didn't know if it would be useful for me to tell you this. She's like, but I have suspected for quite a not like a long time now that you are like definitely very far on the spectrum.
Wow.
And when she told me that, I was so shocked, but also not really, because it kind of made sense. And, you know, I cried and I was like, oh my God, I can't believe it. And then I went and got tested, and yep, there you go, bona fide ASD.
Rita, how are you now? Can you give me a little bit of a snapshot of your life now?
Yeah, I think that was a concern a lot of people had when they finished my book. They're like, are you okay? And I'm like, I was not okay when I finished that book. I'm like, but, you know, I'm in my mid-20s and things flux and change so quickly. So, yeah, I'm a lot happier now. And that book, when it's all shoved in together, it's like, fuck, is she all right? But, you know, when you now who I am and what I've learnt about myself from writing that book was just such a relief. It put so much into perspective for me. You know, it made me go get diagnosed with autism. It made me get into a good relationship. It made me have a better relationship with myself. And I think it can be very healing, I think, for many people. And I highly recommend, if you have the opportunity, to sift through those memories and to write them down, because it actually does start to make things easier and make more sense for you.
Are you still working in the sex industry?
Yes, I'm still an active sex worker. Obviously, at the moment, I can't work because of COVID-19, but I am doing online work at the moment.
How does that work?
So the laws at the moment they change state to state. In Victoria, in this moment, on the 12th of the 5th, 2020, they've actually closed all the brothels, strip clubs, and quite heavily fining sex workers. The fine in Victoria at the moment, if you're caught doing an outcall, is $19,700.
Wow.
Yeah, which seems, when you think about it, pretty fucking unfair. And
yeah, people are allowed to still go on Tinder dates, right?
Oh, yeah.
Or they are in New South Wales. I'm not sure about Victoria.
Yeah, Victoria's a bit different. So hopefully once the laws come back to normal, which, you know, we would like to go back to work eventually, hopefully. They're not included at the moment in the stage 3 restrictions. I think that we're still waiting to see what's going to happen.
Yeah, I didn't notice that on ScoMo's PowerPoint presentation. There was no mention of sex workers. Someone from the press gallery should have asked, though.
Someone actually asked Dan Andrews in the one recently. They were like, when a strip club's going to open? And he was pretty good. He was kind of had a joke about it, but we don't know. And I think that one of the fears in the sex work community at the moment is, are we going to be allowed to come back? Even with the end of the lockdown, you know, and that is, I think, a really valid concern, to be nervous about all these new powers are brought in and these emergency powers. Are we going to see our jobs being allowed? Are we going to be allowed to return to them legally at some point?
Sex work is often portrayed as something that people do out of desperation, as an interim, as a means to an end. You know, how would you describe it how it is for you?
I mean, it can be those things. I've come to sex work at different stages in my life for those exact reasons, out of desperation, in the interim, and for money. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I don't think, like any kind of labour, sometimes and as women especially, and for trans women and for women from different backgrounds, like, it's one of the very few jobs that you can go into and make the kind of money that you can take care of a family on, you know, like really, like, and especially I think for mums, when they're like, if they've got a partner and they're not together anymore and you have the option, it's like, okay, I can do 2 bookings a week, or I can do 4 shifts at the brothel, or I can do 3 nights at the strip club, and I get daycare covered, all my groceries covered. You know, I can see, I don't think it should be something that has to be empowering, or it has to be good, or you need to do it for the right reasons, or whatever that is. I think it is actually fine for it to be something that you're like, I don't love this, but it puts a roof over my head and it and it pays for my bills and it keeps me safe, like that's fine, you know?
Is that how would you describe your relationship to it now?
Like any job, it ebbs and flows. I think that I have days where I really love it and I have days where I'm really exhausted, especially being autistic as well too. The thing for me is not so much the sex. It's actually the interpersonal stuff, which is incredibly fucking tiring. And like and having to kind of mask and behave a certain way. And I'm lucky some of my clients love that I'm kooky and they're like, you know, some of them are even on the spectrum themselves, God bless them. And some of them, it's very performative. And so, yeah, it's just up and down. Sometimes I love it. Sometimes I hate it. Sometimes I don't care about it at all. But it's my job, and it means that I've been able to afford and to give myself the best life that I can.
That's author and sex worker Rita Therese. I loved how honest she is in her book, and she was in our conversation as well about the ups and downs of the industry that she works in. Rita's book Come is published by Allen and Unwin, and you can get it at your local bookstore, which is hopefully back open. My local is, and I've already been in and stocked up on all the latest books I wanted to get my hands on. Don't forget, if you've loved this episode of No Filter, we've got loads about sex in your stream. Just a few weeks ago, I spoke to the brilliant Tracy Cox, yes, that's her real name, on how to get the fun back into your sex life, no matter how old or young or single you are. Next week, the extraordinary Andrew Solomon will be on No Filter. He tells the story of how he came to be part of an extremely modern and queer Brady Bunch. Take care. Until then, lots of love. I'll see you soon.